Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Buffano. Welcome to my lecture series on Middle East politics. For today's lecture, we're going to be talking about military dictatorships in the Middle East and more generally about authoritarianism in the region. So let's get started. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, military dictatorships. All right, so we're starting a new unit here. This is our 19th lecture in this series. And for the next couple of lectures, we're going to shift away from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And now we're going to look at authoritarianism in the Middle East. Now, authoritarian regimes are regimes in which there is no real competition for political power to control the states. There are usually a small group of individuals, often dominated by a dictator, that dominate the state, right? And so in the case of the Middle East, in today's world, most of the countries of the region are authoritarianism. And this has been the case since independence from European rule. So what you're looking at here is a map of Freedom House. All of the countries that are in purple, according to Freedom House, are not free. Now, Freedom House, they have a different set of measures to determine how democratic a country is. So, for example, does a country have free and fair elections that are competitive? Does the state allow civil liberties like freedom of speech? And does the state have political rights, such as the right to vote? Can the opposition mobilize, form political parties and civil society organizations, and speak out against the government? And do they have the ability to actually contest those elections? Furthermore, do those elections actually lead to representatives controlling the legislative and executive branches? Right? So are those representatives writing laws and enforcing them? And finally, is there an independent judiciary with the rule of law that protects the basic civil rights and civil liberties of individuals in society? So there's this Freedom House has a lot of these different variables they measure. It's on a scale of 0 to 100. And for those who score very low on this, they are labeled as not free. And as you can see from our map here, just about all of these countries are considered not free. Some countries as well are considered partly free if they score somewhere in the middle of that 0 to 100 scale. So you see there's a couple of countries such as Turkey that fall under this sort of label. And finally, very few countries historically in the Middle East have been considered free. Tunisia did have a period for about a decade from 2011 to 2021 where they scored as free on this metric. Israel today is the only country that's labeled as a democracy. And of course, this is very contentious because while Israel does have free and fair elections, currently they are occupying the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And there are all sorts of problems as well in Israel with suppression of its Arab Muslim minority. So this is a region that is dominated by dictatorships. So it's one thing this region has in common, right? Lots of authoritarian regimes. However, the nature of these authoritarian regimes are quite diverse. There are many different types of dictatorships out there. Now, what exactly is a regime? A regime are the rules that determine who has power within the state and what they can do with that power. Regimes can be democracies or they can be dictatorships. And amongst authoritarian regimes, there are many different types of rules that determine who can come into power and what they can do with it. Middle East dictatorships are incredibly diverse and they're incredibly dynamic in nature. Over the next couple of lectures, we are going to be discussing military regimes, single party regimes, monarchies, what we call electoral authoritarian regimes, theocracies, such as what we find in Iran today. And we're going to compare and contrast them. And what you're going to find is not all dictatorships are alike. Some are very different. Some have very different rules for determining who comes into power and what those individuals can do with it. And on top of it, they are dynamic. They change over time, okay, as you're going to find out. Now, in today's lecture, we're going to specifically zoom in on military dictatorships. And so for this lecture, we have several objectives. We're going to understand what are military coups and why so many have taken place in the Middle East since independence from European colonial rule. So that's objective number one. So why is it that the military has come into power in some of these states? Number two, we're going to understand what military juntas are. In other words, what are military dictatorships? And we're also going to understand as well why they don't last very long. So while the Middle East has had a lot of military coups, the military juntas that have been established usually only last about a year or two, and then they go away, they disappear. So we're going to try to understand why that's the case. Now, even though military dictatorships are short-lived, the ramifications they've had for the region have been enormous. Okay, they affect the dictatorships of the region even after the generals decide to leave power and return to the barracks. So we're going to understand the effects of military rule on authoritarianism in the region over the long term. As you're going to find out, this is going to have some detrimental effects on economic development within the region and the stability of these states. Now, in order to really be able to talk about this topic, there are a couple of key things I have to really address. So number one, what is the expected role of a military in a democracy? So I often ask this of my students. Well, when most of you think of militaries, you often think of these institutions, right? Their job is to defend the country from external enemies and maybe sometimes to help with internal stability. They're organized forces, okay, that have the ability to wage war and engage in violence. So militaries, they're expected to be professional. They are expected to have an officer corps that is well trained and that can train troops to engage in warfare. They're also expected to be well armed and they're expected to be professional. They're expected to stay out of politics. So when you think about like a democracy such as the United States, our generals, they are not elected officials. They are not making political decisions. They're not even deciding when we go to war or with whom we go to war to. Their job, our generals and the military officers, they have to follow the orders of civilians and they have to train the troops and engage in war when the civilians tell them to go to war. And if the civilians tell them to stop engaging in war, they have to stop engaging in war. So militaries, they have to be professional, well organized, and they stay out of politics. They are supposed to be politically neutral. So they're not supposed to be Republicans or Democrats, for example, in the United States. They are not supposed to be making political decisions. And what's critical about this is that by not staying in politics, the military keeps its professional ethos. It maintains its professionalism so that it could focus on its one main job, defending the country. Now, here's what's interesting, though. This is kind of a paradox here, right? So the U.S. military, for example, as well as many other militaries across the globe, are incredibly powerful. They have by far the most extensive capacity to engage in violence, right? So when you think of the U.S. military, it's got tanks, it's got an air force. This is something that no other set of organizations or movements have in the United States. So why does the United States military, why has it never overthrown the government? In fact, why do we find in so many democracies across the globe powerful militaries not deciding, hey, let's just take over the government? Those elected civilians, they don't directly run the armed forces. So why don't they? Well, let's think about this from, just a kind of common sense sort of framework here. Well, number one, a good majority of our troops, as well as our officers, have been really indoctrinated since the beginning of their lives to believe in democracy and the rule of law, to believe in the efficacy of elections, and they've come to love their nation, right, as well as the regime that rules over them, to love the Constitution. So, number one, part of the reason why officers don't go and tell their troops to stage a coup, take over the government, is because they know that most of those individuals in the armed forces support the current government. So within democracies, usually the government has a lot of legitimacy, right? So thus the armed forces is not going to try to overthrow that government, right? So if an officer tries to stage a coup, but none of the soldiers follow their orders, that's a big problem, right? So that's number one. Number two, in democracies like the United States, as well as in many dictatorships out there, the military receives a lot of perks. They are often well funded. They have access to social welfare benefits. They have access to good jobs. And so thus they have those kind of economic incentives. So in the US, for example, soldiers are well paid. And once they leave the military, they often get access to a good education, good pensions. Thus you have those economic incentives, right? This keeps the military loyal. But there are instances throughout world history where the military decides to go beyond its role of defending the country and they decide to engage in politics, sometimes in very aggressive and direct ways. And the most aggressive form of this is through what's called a military coup. Now, a coup d'etat is when the military overthrows the state. A group of officers decide to take the tanks to the streets and they take over the government. Now, coups, when they do take place, they are planned in secret, often by frustrated officers, generals, lieutenants, who decide to come together and secretly plan this. Now, it has to be in secret, right? Because if the civilian leadership and their allies find out about this, they could arrest those officers who are planning the coup and put them in prison. Furthermore, there are some officers that are not going to support the coup. And so the ones who are planning the coup, they have to do this in secret. And they've got to find officers that they trust, that they know are frustrated with the government. And when they engage in the coup, it's got to be quick. It has to be fast. They have to take to the streets quickly. The tanks have to hit the streets. They have to surround the presidential palace or the palace of the monarch. They have to put the president or the king in prison immediately. They have to take control of the media outlets, so they will often surround the radio stations or the television stations. They have to take control over public discourse, and they have to announce to the public, the tanks are in the streets, we've taken over control of the government. Now, not all coups succeed. Sometimes officers tell their troops to take the streets, sometimes they don't. Sometimes other officers refuse to accept the coup and they mobilize in defense of the state. And sometimes, the ruling authorities can outmaneuver the coup leaders. So sometimes coups are not successful, but when they are successful, okay, the military officers then take power. In the Middle East, in the period after World War II and the decades that followed, there have been about 25 successful military coups. So from the data I looked at from 1945 to 2023, there's been about 25 successful ones. Some scholars have slightly different definitions of what constitutes a coup. So, there are slight differences, but there's been about 25 of them that have taken place where the military has overthrown the government. And as you can imagine, most of these coups took place in the aftermath of independence from European rule and during the height of the Cold War, when there was a lot of instability throughout the globe in developing countries. So most of these coups took place in the 1950s and the 1970s. And a disproportionate number of them took place in those unstable states we talked about in a previous lecture, in those Sykes-Picot states, those states that were artificially created by the Europeans after World War I. So Iraq, Syria, okay, these states experienced a lot of military coups, and as well as a lot of civil wars and instability more generally. Whereas countries such as, for example, Saudi Arabia, the Arab Gulf states, which have very different histories, they experienced far fewer coups. Now, this doesn't mean all the coups were successful. There were also about 25 failed coups in the region. So there's been mixed success with these military coups. And what's going to happen over time is that governments are going to better learn how to defend themselves from these coups. We call this coup proofing. We're going to talk about this a little later. So there have been about 25 failed ones that have taken place. Now, the number of coups, they declined by the 1980s and 1990s as some of these regimes did begin to develop more stability as well as develop ways to prevent these coups from taking place. So we're going to talk more about that. So this is the data here. Okay, so we can see here that we have about this kind of trend here where the number of coups rose in the 1950s and 60s after independence from European rule and during the height of the Cold War, and then they start to decline in the following decades. There's been a slight uptick since the Arab Spring in 2011. We'll talk about that later in the semester. So these are the number of coups here that have taken place. And as you can see here in black, we have our successful coups. In white, we have our failures. So it's split about 50-50, the number of successful and the number of failed coups in the region. So why coup d'etats? Like, why did they take place? Well, coups take place for a number of different reasons. Now, some of these reasons are external to the nature of the militaries that lead the coups themselves, meaning they take place because of factors outside of that military that led the coup. And so the biggest factor here with external dynamics, that is factors outside the military, is that a country has severe political and economic instability. This instability can be caused by factors internal to a country, such as ethnic conflict, civil war, severe economic depressions, mass protests, and revolutionary movements. When there is severe instability and governments, civilian governments, start to lose control of the situation, the military might step into power as a means to prevent civil war or to stop a current civil war and to bring back stability to the nation. And so thus, you're going to see a situation where the military justifies the coup on the basis of bringing stability back to the nation. And this is, of course, found typically in a lot of countries immediately after independence, because a lot of post-independent countries often have very new states that are fragile, that lack legitimacy, that suffer from problems like ethnic conflict and instability. And thus, militaries justify coming into power. And so thus, these conditions legitimize coups, right? Those military officers that step into power, they have to justify it if they want civilians to accept the coup itself. In fact, one of the reasons why military officers won't engage in coups is if they think the public won't accept it, right? And they think their own soldiers won't accept it. So thus, military officers, they do realize that, hey, if we're going to step into power, we need people to support this thing, including our own soldiers. Now, coups as well can also take place because of the internal dynamics within the military itself, factors within the military that inspire the coup. So this can take place when civilian officials seriously neglect the state of the military. When military officers feel that not enough money is being spent on the military itself, when the weapons that are being bought are poor in quality, when the military is poorly organized, or when the military performs poorly in civil wars or international wars because of the neglect of the military as an institution. So as you learned earlier in the semester, Arab militaries performed very poorly in that 1948 war against Israel, right? So when you perform poorly on the battlefield because the military needs are neglected, this can make officers very angry. Now, part of this as well can happen when civilian regimes heavily politicize the military, when they start putting officers in charge who are not very professional and are heavily politicized. They were put there because of their ideological loyalty and not because they were good professional soldiers. Sometimes civilian leaders will do this because they want to ensure the loyalty of their military. But ironically, by politicizing the military in this way, this could make it so that the officers get used to interfering in political affairs and getting involved in politics. So civilian officials, if they want to prevent a coup, they should make sure that the military is professionalized as possible. But if the military is not professional, they're not focused on their main job of defending the country, this might incentivize coups. And so we tend to find coups more when previous regimes filled officer corps with political loyalists. So according to Samuel Huntington in his famous work, The Soldier in the Changing State, stable democracies, they keep their militaries professional. Now, of course, one of the challenges of developing a professional armed forces is if you're developing a new military from scratch, right? So for post-independence regimes that are trying to develop new militaries, this was the case in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, those kind of Sykes-Picot regimes that, got created overnight. When you're trying to create a new military, that professional ethos isn't there yet. You have to hire new officers, you got to train new soldiers, and thus it's going to take time to develop that professional ethos. It's not going to be there right away. So in these very new regimes, you are more likely to see a lot of coups as a consequence of this. And finally, once coups do start to take place, the military starts to get used to them, and thus coups become more of a possibility in the minds of officers. And so thus a country that has a history of coups is more likely to have future coups. So Syria, for example, had many coups from 1949 up until 1970. Coups tend to follow each other in succession. And so here, let's take a look at a map on where coups have taken place from 1946 to 2017. The countries in dark red have had a lot of coups. These countries that are in white have had no coups at all. Some countries have had multiple coups. Some have only one. So notice on this map, where have the coups taken place here? Well, they've taken place in parts of the developing world, countries that have a lot more poverty and political instability, countries that were ruled by Europeans and some of which only recently gained their independence, such as the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so take a look. We have in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, where most of our coups have taken place. Whereas in North America, Western Europe, East Asia, such as Japan, these countries have experienced far less coups, especially very recently in world history. So there is a trend in terms of where coups take place. And of course, in the Middle East, there have been a ton of coups, especially within our Sykes-Picot region. Now, what are some of the challenges after independence that the Middle East face specifically? Well, many of those post-independence states severely lacked legitimacy. Egypt, Iraq, Libya, and Jordan, for example, they had these monarchs that were propped up during the colonial era. And because of this, those states lacked legitimacy. So, for example, we talked about how in Iraq and Jordan, the British propped up sons of the Sharif Hussein's family of Mecca. So King Faisal was put in charge of Iraq. In Jordan, it was King Hussein who was put in power. King Abdullah, who was put into power. And in those two countries, right, you had these kind of artificial governments propped up by the European powers, and thus they lacked a lot of legitimacy. In Egypt, following the British invasion in 1882, they kept the Muhammad Ali dynasty in power, but they propped up monarchs from that family that were loyal to the Europeans, to the British, and thus they didn't have much in the way of popular legitimacy. Furthermore, during the era of the middle of the 20th century, we talked about how in the Arab world, there was this movement known as Arab nationalism that was spreading throughout the region, that was promoting socialism, socioeconomic reforms, such as investment in industry. It was an anti-Western movement, pro-Arab unity across the world, anti-Israel and anti-Western. And so this social movement that was spreading throughout the Middle East, they were opposed to these Western pro-Western governments, and they were also opposed to the traditional elites, the traditional religious establishment, the traditional landowners, and these traditional elites were opposed to left-wing reforms. So there was, after independence, these strong social movements that were promoting change across the region. This was leading to a lot of instability in these Sykes-Picot regimes. And thus, as a consequence, many of these governments were overthrown in military coups in the aftermath. In Iraq, Egypt, Syria, we're going to see lots of coups take place. Now, There was also other challenges as well. We learned that because of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the San Remo Agreement, the creation of those new states, these states were very ethnically diverse, often with one ethnic group being placed in charge and ethnic minorities facing suppression. This is going to lead to a lot of problems with protests and civil wars in these new states. And as I said, with instability comes military coups. So we're going to see rebellion by the Kurds in Iraq. We're going to see problems with ethnic conflict in Syria. We're going to see all sorts of challenges created by the Lebanese civil war and the Israeli Arab conflicts. That's going to create all sorts of problems. And as a result, militaries as well are going to use this as an excuse to come into power. And of course, the initial failures of Arab militaries against Israel in 1948, this is going to lead to a lot of angry officers as well that are going to justify their coups on the basis that, those European-backed monarchies, they're not spending enough on the military. They're not doing enough to invest in the military so that they could push back against the Israeli state. So we're going to see, as a consequence of this, some coups that are going to be in response to those failed wars against Israel, whether it's in 1948 or after that Six-Day War in 1967. That's going to create all sorts of issues with instability. And then finally, we have these global dynamics created by the Cold War. In the 50s and 60s, the Soviet Union, communist country, was competing with the United States, a capitalist country, for global supremacy. And they were backing a lot of coups in different parts of the world. And the United States was no exception. So, for example, we have U.S.-backed coups in Iran in 1953, in Syria in 1949. We have a lot of Soviet-backed military coups in this region as well during this era. So lots of instability and violence created by this. So due to all these different factors, the 50s and 60s was really this prime era in which you had a lot of these unstable post-independent states and in this Cold War environment that was really creating this kind of breeding ground for coups. And perhaps the most famous of these coups within the Arab world was Egypt's 1952 military coup led by the Free Officers. The leader of this coup here, as we discussed in a previous lecture, was Gamal Abdel Nasser. And most of these coup leaders were sympathetic to Arab nationalism. They tended to be young officers, lieutenants. And while technically Mohammed Naguib, who was a general, was the technical leader of this coup, really was Gamal Abdel Nasser and his loyalists that were in charge of it. And so we see coups take place all across the region. In 1952, in Egypt, in 1958, in Iraq, in Syria itself experienced well over a dozen failed and successful coups from 1949 to 1970. So lots of coups took place there. We also see failed coups in Jordan, for example. There was a coup in Algeria in 1965. Turkey had 4 coups from 1960, 1971, 1980, and 1997. And the list goes on and on and on. So lots of coups during this era. Now, when these coups take place, what often happens is the officers take control of the government. The constitution or the old government gets suspended, and the military takes control of the state. We call this a military dictatorship. And what the officers often do is they form something called a military junta. It's a council of the armed forces that directly runs the government. So the junta consist of these officers. They form this ruling council, and basically they become judge, jury, and executioner. They become the executive, legislative, and judicial branches wrapped up into a single body. They do form a cabinet, just like in a democracy, like with the president, but this cabinet is staffed usually mainly by military officers. Sometimes they'll bring in civilians into the junta, but usually it's just military officers that are running the show. And the legitimacy of this coup is on the basis that the officers are going to bring stability back to the country. The junta is going to be temporary, and then they will return power to civilians at some time in the near future. Now, what sometimes happens in these coups is that the officers will share power, right? And so you'll have multiple officers, they'll sit down, behind closed doors, and they'll have votes on decision making. Sometimes what can also happen is that one of the coup leaders can centralize control of the junta and develop what is called a personalistic dictatorship. In fact, this often happens. So in in Chile with Pinochet in 1973, with Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1952, with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya after 1969, personalistic dictatorships often emerge here. And so, thus, they derive their political legitimacy on this kind of temporary legitimacy to restore political legitimacy, to restore political stability. They are typically, that, although not always, created after coups. So, of course, sometimes these coup leaders can hand power right away back to civilians, but usually they will form a junta. And so thus, in Egypt, the coup officers, they formed something called the Revolutionary Command Council, which ruled Egypt for 2 years from 1952 to 1954. And while Mohammed Naguib was technically president, it was Gamal Abdel Nasser. He's going to centralize control over this military junta and eventually become a personalistic dictator in the process. Now, juntas, they don't last long. They have very short lifespans. In fact, they have the shortest lifespans out of all dictatorships. And this kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Because their whole legitimacy is based on the idea that they're just stepping into power temporarily to restore stability. And on top of that as well, officers, they're not very good at running governments. They don't have experience running bureaucracies, running tax collection, educational institutions, building roads and bridges. They're just not very good at it. And on top of that, domestic bureaucracies are very different from the military. Militaries have top-down decision-making with really tight sense of discipline, whereas with civilian bureaucracies, there's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of discussions and debates. It's very different how civilian bureaucracies are run from the military. So officers, they're not very good at running governments. Furthermore, their legitimacy is not based on running the country over the long term, right? So thus, they lack what generally happens is the longer they stay in power, the longer and longer the public will start to get frustrated with these juntas, and they will start to demand that the juntas step down. So these regimes tend to have a lot of public protests take place in the aftermath. Now, another challenge with these dictatorships is that the militaries often lose their professionalism. Once the military steps into power and they start getting involved in politics, they start to neglect their jobs of defending the country from external and internal enemies. And because they often get very bad at doing this, you end up getting more instability as a result of juntas. Paradoxically, military dictatorships often have the least stability out of other types of dictatorships. And thus, this also hurts their one form of legitimacy, the fact that they're there to keep stability in the country. So by becoming involved in domestic political and economic matters, they can severely lose their legitimacy. And so this is a big problem for these type of regimes. And so thus, they tend to perform very poorly when it comes to running the government. They're very bad at running schools, building infrastructure, collecting taxes. They do a very bad job at it overall. And I'm going to show you the statistics on this in a second. And so thus, their lifespan is the shortest out of all different types of regimes. Juntas in the Middle East usually do not last more than a year or two before collapsing. A year or two at most, and then usually they are done. Now, sometimes what will happen is the military leaders will just voluntarily step out of power and hand power back to civilians, or they'll themselves become civilian leaders by taking off their uniforms. Sometimes they themselves get overthrown in military coups or via revolutions and mass protests. So lots of instability. So just let's look at the statistics here in terms of military governance. They perform very poorly. So the World Bank keeps statistics on government effectiveness. They have this index which keeps track of various statistics. So, for example, levels of corruption. How much do public officials, abuse their positions of power and, for example, require bribes for civilians to receive services? How efficient are their bureaucracies at collecting taxes and building roads? How good are they in terms of the rule of law and enforcing the law effectively across the country? So they have this index, the World Bank, and we have all these measurements across different types of dictatorships. And as you can see here, the average quality governance scores is the lowest on average for military dictatorships in comparison with civilian regimes, as well as various different types of civilian regimes, such as single party dictatorships, monarchies, and so on and so forth. They do not do very well in terms of governance. And because of this, their lifespans are the shortest. Now, as I said, there's different measures of what constitutes a military coup in a military regime, but on all measures that we have of military regimes, we find that they have the highest failure rates. On any given year, anywhere between 15 to 20% of military regimes collapse. Okay. So in contrast, single party regimes, that number is only a little over 5% on average, for example. So they have the highest rates of failure where the regime will collapse. And so thus these regimes tend to get disbanded. So all these military regimes in the Middle East did not last very long. So facing this opposition, military juntas will often transition to civilian rule. They often do this to try to prevent a civil war or conflict or a split within the armed forces. So some will return power to civilian regimes where they'll allow civilians to come back into power. And the soldiers and the officers will return to the barracks as a consequence of this. Now, what they will sometimes do is they will often threaten future coups if the military's interests are not met. So they'll say to the civilian leaders, look, you can come back into power, but you got to keep the military well funded and you got to do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, we are coming back into power. So this sometimes happens. And the classic case of this in the Middle East was with the Turkish coups. And we're going to talk about this later in the semester with Turkey. They had 4 coups after the end of World War II. And each time the juntas did not last long. And the officers, they went back to the barracks, but they told the civilian leaders, do X, Y, and Z. And if not, we will overthrow you again. And in fact, this is what happened. The military periodically kept coming back into power time after time. And we'll find out why this was the case later in the semester. Now, sometimes the junta leaders will themselves become civilian rulers. And this was the most common case in the Middle East, particularly in the Arab world. The coup leaders take off their military uniforms and they put on a suit and tie and they become a president. And thus, they leave the military. And these regimes, in many ways, are military rule disguised as civilian rule. So they'll take off their uniforms, they'll run in fixed elections, they'll often create a political party, and they will then become civilian dictators. And so thus, the idea by becoming civilians, creating a political party that will be popular with the masses, promoting some mass popular ideology, incorporating many civilians into the regime in the process. This can give the military leaders thus greater legitimacy to continue ruling, but it no longer functions as a military regime because the junta gets disbanded and they will often transition to some other type of civilian dictatorship. And in fact, this is what happened with most coups in the Arab world, right? So coup takes place, you get this short-lived junta, then the officers leave power in order to, so the officers will leave the military and become civilian rulers. And this is what Gamal Abdel Nasser did. So that military junta was very short-lived, only 2 years. In 1954, he establishes a single-party dictatorship in an Arab republic. He becomes the president of the country in fixed elections. He creates eventually this Arab socialist party, and he promotes Arab nationalism, and he develops this mass base of popularity as the president of Egypt. And he would be president until his death in 1970. His single-party dictatorship lasted much longer than the actual military junta. All right, coup proofing. Now, here's the thing, the long-term impact. So even though these juntas did not last long, the ramifications they had for these countries were quite dramatic. The military officers often received benefits upon returning to the barracks. So in order to prevent future coups, these new civilian dictatorships, often led by former military officers, they wanted to keep the military happy, right? So in order to do that, you promise perks for the military officers, promising them high salaries, access to public housing, education for their children, special hospitals with good health care. So you try to keep the military happy by overspending on the military. This is called coup proofing, when you try to prevent a coup in the future. Furthermore, the military will often as well give other sorts of perks to these officers. Sometimes they'll give them control to access to state-controlled lands, as well as to state-controlled public companies and factories. Oftentimes, a lot of these retired officers will get access to a lot of land, access to a lot of public housing, as well as control of public businesses. And sometimes as well, when they retire, they'll get access to positions of political power in the bureaucracy. So once you retire as an officer, you then get these nice little perks. You will become the head of a bureaucracy. You'll get a nice cushy job, or their children will get nice cushy jobs. And this was kind of a learning process. As I said, sometimes coups followed other coups. So if you wanted to prevent future coups, make the military as happy as possible, give them access to as much resources as you can. And so this coup proofing process was meant to prevent a coup, right? You do this to prevent coups from happening in the future. And so what ends up happening because of this coup proofing is that the military thus takes on a lot of political power and economic power, even though they don't technically govern. Even though the junta is gone, there is no military junta anymore. The officers continue to have access to a lot of resources, and they're heavily politicized. Their members often control a lot of bureaucracies. They're often have access to a lot of resources. So in Egypt today, for example, the military controls about approximately half of the economy, directly or indirectly. They also as well run a lot of businesses. The officers today run a lot of factories. They run tourist resorts. I mean, they're in all parts of the economy today, and they have access to a lot of resources. And in fact, their soldiers are often not just engaged in training how to defend the country. Oftentimes they're running hotels and working on farms and running factories. So lots of challenges here. And of course, as you can imagine, this distracts the military from its core goal of defending the country from external or internal enemies. This leads to a lot of problem with corruption, and it also creates severe economic problems because that's less money for education, less money for social welfare programs and for economic development, and more money in the pockets of corrupt military officers. I recommend highly this book by Stephen Cook. It's called Ruling But Not Governing: The Military and Political Development in Egypt, Algeria, and Turkey. When you highly invest in the military in this way to coup-proof, it leads to a situation that even though the military is not directly ruling the government, they're kind of behind the scenes with a lot of political power, and they could threaten future coups if civilian officials do something that crosses them, right? So he called this, Stephen Cook, ruling but not governing, right? So the civilian officials are kind of the facade of power, but the military leaders kind of sit in the background, just kind of controlling the situation. And thus, and this will be my last slide here, by the way, we have a situation where militaries in the region are overfunded and domestic bureaucracies are underfunded. Middle East governments spend about 13% of their budgets on the military, while the global average is about 6.2%, double the global average. And for developing countries, this is a big problem, right? Because these countries really need to invest in education, healthcare, and in infrastructure, but too much is being spent on the military. And more spending on the military means less spending on these other critical factors that are necessary for economic developments. And it also means as well more coercive regimes. So dictators can use their very powerful militaries to suppress dissent. And since these militaries are highly politicized, they are more likely to get involved in suppressing protests and defending dictators when need be. They're also as well more likely to engage in coups. So big problems for the region here. And so this, by the way, is just showing military spending across the region. And by the way, this is not just because of coup proofing, but just all the instability created by warfares, conflicts, civil wars, and international conflicts. We talked about the Lebanese Civil War and the Arab-Israeli conflicts already. We're going to talk about more wars later in the semester. So we've got too much of the military being involved in conflicts. Okay, so that does it for my lecture today, guys. Thanks for tuning in. For next class, we're going to talk about another type of authoritarian regime in the region, single-party regimes. Till then, I'll see you next time.